Hi, my name's Dave. I'm a Sydney-based cinematographer and director, and Canon gave me and my collaborator James the new C300 Mark III to test out for a few days. I run a small production company here in Sydney and have been filming TV shows and documentaries for a few years now, and I've always preferred the Canon cameras mostly for their ergonomics and sort of usability and their colour science. Just to give you a bit of an idea of the structure of the video, we're going to look at some of the general features of the camera before having a bit of a dynamic range test, and then seeing how it goes on a kind of typical documentary style shoot where we'll push the ISO a bit. We're then going to take a look at a more stylized commercial shoot, filming in RAW, and then at the end I've just got a stack of quick facts that we can kind of go over, stuff that over the course of shooting we found that might just be of interest. If you want to use the camera on the shoulder as a fully rigged up broadcast cam, you totally can put a big PL lens on the front of it. Or if you want to strip it right back down, you can kind of make it a low profile handheld rig. All you've got to do is unscrew a few bits and pop off the external accessories. The V-lock expansion plates, the interchangeable lens mounts, they're all compatible with this camera. One of my favorite features is the fact that the rear EVF is an optional accessory, and that means that you can pop it straight off the camera, which makes balancing it on a gimbal a lot easier. They've included timecode in the base body, which is really handy, and it also takes the new CF Express media, which is the same size as an XQD card, and it reformats and copies really fast. It's a traditional Super 35mm sensor, which means it works with both full-frame lenses and APS-C lenses, but you don't get that benefit of having a full frame, which means you get a little bit less control over your depth of field. Because the image processor isn't having to deal with all that full frame information, it means the C300 Mark III can record 120 frames per second in RAW at 4K. You can also do it at the standard 10-bit XF-AVC codec as well. There's no crop, we're just talking Super 35mm 4K. If you want to go even higher, it can do 180 frames per second in 2K, which is pretty nuts. It just crops into Super 16mm. And again, that's in RAW and in XF-AVC. Canon have never really been that competitive when it comes to having high frame rates in their cameras, so to see them put this kind of feature into the C300 Mark III, honestly, it's really surprising. So the other feature that really stands out is something called dual gain output, or DGO, which is a little bit different from dual ISO, which is a feature that has become a bit more common in other cameras quite recently. Honestly, I won't go too far down the tech rabbit hole on DGO, but by using this dual gain output tech on the sensor, it basically means the noise in the C300 Mark III is greatly reduced, and that means that the camera is capable of a really high dynamic range. So Canon is saying that the C300 Mark III is capable of 16 plus stops of dynamic range, which basically would put it up there as being some of the highest dynamic range of any camera on the market. So for Canon cameras, C-Log2 is the flatter picture profile, and that's the one that they're saying provides this greater dynamic range. So for this video, all of our filming has been in C-Log2. We've also stuck where we can to the camera's native ISO of 800, because again, that helps give you the best dynamic range performance, and all of our grading has been in Resolve. So DGO is not something that you switch off and on in the camera. It's just always running as long as you're shooting below 60 frames per second. So for us, we're going to go between 25 frames per second and 100 frames per second, because then we'll hopefully be able to see the DGO sort of going off and on. In order to keep our exposure the same between the two shots, we're going to adjust the shutter. So here you can see we've got a bit of a standard interview set up with Liz. We're filming in both RAW and XF-AVC at 25 frames per second. And now we'll switch to 100 frames per second and change the shutter to give ourselves 2 extra stops of light. So looking at the log, you can pretty clearly see that the noise in the shadows is reduced quite a lot when the DGO is active. So if we go between 25 frames per second and 100 frames per second, and you can see that the DGO is switching on and off, and that those blacks are getting really noisy when it's off. When we put the images into a Rec 709 color space and add some contrast back in, that difference is a bit more subtle. If you look at the histogram, you can see that the DGO shots have a bit more range. So seeing as this extra dynamic range is something that it looks like we're primarily going to see the benefit of in the shadows, we framed up a bit of a darker shot to see if we could more clearly see the difference between having DGO on and off. So we did also film in RAW just like with the previous tests, but just because the footage and the noise is looking so similar, we'll focus on the XF-AVC. So as you can clearly see in the log images, the DGO enabled shots are much less noisy. I guess the way to think about this is that when you're adding contrast back into an image in post to clean up noise, you basically need to add less of it to the DGO shots in order to get an acceptable level of noise and an image that looks clean. So that means that you're actually left with more dynamic range overall in the image because you haven't had to crush those blacks so far. I'm really looking forward to seeing some more scientific tests where people can measure the exact dynamic range out of the sensor, just to see if it's actually stacking up to that advertised 16 plus stops. But as you can see from this fairly basic test, there's definitely a noticeable improvement that we're seeing just in this setup. So another thing that's probably worth mentioning is that I've heard that the highlight roll-off in this camera is sort of the best that Canon's ever developed. We didn't really get a chance to test it much in this video, but I would be really interested to see how it stacks up against something like an ARRI. Here's two quick shots anyway with some blown out highlights, just so you can get a quick idea of what the roll-off looks like. So for the documentary style shooting, we filmed in a mix of 4K and in HD, just because we knew we'd be pushing the higher end of the camera in a later test, and we wanted to make sure that it still kind of did its job as a HD broadcast camera, because at least in Australia, a lot of the networks still want stuff shot in HD. So we've just labeled in the edit whether a clip was HD or 4K, and it's just been upscaled in the timeline because this video is 4K. So really similar to the C300 Mark II, Canon colors look great, and it's really easy to get sort of great images out of the box with this camera. So this camera also has new camera stabilization tech. It's not mechanical stabilization. It crops the sensor in a little bit and stabilizes that way. So here's a shot from a cine lens with no IS in the lens, and now with the in-camera stabilization turned on. Now here's a shot from a lens that has image stabilization, but it's turned off, and the body stabilization is turned off. Now with lens stabilization only turned on. Now with both lens stabilization turned on and camera stabilization. Now with lens stabilization off and camera stabilization on. So it's really interesting to see that if you're using an IS lens and you have the IS flicked off, but you've got camera stabilization on, no stabilization is being applied from the camera. I kind of get like the reasoning behind doing this, but it's a little bit confusing, and I'm sure some people would not realize that they're not getting the benefit of in-camera stabilization when they think they are. So just to recap, if you have an IS lens and you turn the IS off, you cannot use the in-camera stabilization. So now let's have a look at some shots that have a bit more movement in them, just to see how the stabilizer treats that movement. So you can pretty clearly see that the stabilizer is definitely smoothing things out, but I do find you want to be careful with it because you can get that kind of warp stabilizer jelly look that I personally am not a fan of. I just think it's one of those things that once you get an idea of what shots it's going to work best on, like static wides, you just sort of apply it selectively as you do or don't need it. It's not something I'd leave on all the time, but I do think it's a really handy tool to have. So here's the C300 Mark III and C-Log II, just stepping up through the ISO ranges. And now with a quick grade applied to clean up the blacks. So what's really interesting here is the DGO seems to be the most effective at 800 ISO, and then it sort of wears off as you go up through the range. So just to push things one step further, we turned on the expanded ISO range and took the camera outside to shoot in a really, really dark environment. So acceptable noise level is very much a personal preference kind of thing, but as you can see, the camera is doing a pretty great job of getting up to some high ISO ranges and still maintaining a pretty acceptable level of noise. If you were publishing in HD, you could also film in 4K, and I reckon you could go a step further because as you downscale in the edit, that's going to clean up a whole lot of that noise as well. So finally, here are a couple of shots grabbed at a few different ISO ranges with a quick grade applied, just so you can see how they've cleaned up. It's worth noting that we didn't apply any noise reduction to these shots in Resolve because not everyone's going to use that software, and we just thought it was worth keeping the ISO noise for this test. So our next step was to push some of the higher end features of the camera just to get an idea of how it might perform in kind of a more stylized commercial environment. So we set up a quick cooking shoot with our chef friend Ollie and cut together this little promo. So we filmed the whole piece in 4K in RAW at 120 frames per second, switching to Super 16 2K for the 180 frames per second chocolate and popcorn finale, which we then sort of upscaled and sharpened a little in the edit. So 120 frames per second is really, really slow, and it was a lot of fun to have this sort of frame rate in a Canon body. Given that the 180 frames per second is 2K, we were pretty ready for a significant drop off in terms of quality and noise being introduced. But as you can see here, it's held up really well and is definitely usable. If we jump back to the earlier dynamic range test, we did film that in 180 frames per second as well, just for a quick look. And you can see that once you sharpen and noise reduce the raw image, it does end up looking a little bit better than the XF-AVC. So comparing the image quality of the 180 frames per second in both XF-AVC and RAW, you can see there is a little bit of a difference. And that means that if you're going to shoot this slow, it might actually be worth shooting in RAW because you will see a bump in quality. Something else we found really useful is that with the data rate in RAW, it does drop down as you get into the higher frame rates. So just to compare it to the XF-AVC 4K, at 120 frames per second in 4K, you could record about 166 minutes to a 512 gig card. With RAW, you get about 152 minutes to a 512 gig card. So being able to go into 120 frames per second and not obliterate your card space and still have flexible RAW footage in post, that's a real plus, I think. It'd be great to be able to choose the data rates yourself like you can with Red or Blackmagic, but I do feel like Canon have got the balance right between performance and space, especially at those higher frame rates. Here's a quick chart that you can screenshot that just gives you an idea of the different recording times that you'll get between shooting XF-AVC and RAW. The dual pixel autofocus now works at 120 frames per second. I love using the Canon autofocus. I can imagine that if you were filming sports or any other kind of fast moving action, being able to use autofocus at 120 frames per second and just trigger it on and off would be a huge help. Interestingly though, the autofocus doesn't work at those sort of random intermediate frame rates like 75 frames per second. So face detection autofocus is in there as well, and it works really well, but that only works up to 60p. So quickly switching over to the post side of things, I thought it would be worth showing how fast that CF Express media, which is pretty expensive, dumps to my computer's internal SSD. So being able to dump 330 gigabytes in 5 minutes is really fantastic. I'm saving a lot of time wrangling at the end of the day, provided your client has an SSD to make the most of those speeds. So really throughout our testing, we found that the RAW and XF-AVC codecs were really comparable. So if you shoot RAW, you do get the option of non-destructively choosing your white balance, sharpening, and picture profile in post, which can be really handy. Okay, so here are some things that I thought would be really quickly worth mentioning. The camera turns on in 3 seconds. I don't know for sure, but I think that might be the quickest of any cinema camera out there. You've got 137 minutes of battery life from a BPA 60 and 67 from a BPA 30. Something that I personally am really excited about is the addition of long GOP recording mode, which was on the C300 Mark II, as well as intraframe. So this means if you don't necessarily need that extra image quality and you want to save on file size, you can film in long GOP mode and get a lot more space. The C300 Mark III has an anamorphic mode, which is pretty crazy. And this just gives you a pretty good idea of what kind of images that you're going to be able to see on the C300 Mark III. You've got 10 stops of built-in ND, which means that you can shoot in full sun on a prime lens, wide open, and not have to put a variable ND on the front of the lens. In terms of LUTs, you can now import custom LUTs into the camera. False color, the C300 Mark III has false color built in, which is just a really useful tool for getting correct exposure. So the C300 Mark III feels to me like further proof that Canon have finally decided to start being really aggressive with their cameras. It's a pretty interesting time in the world to be launching any kind of new product, including a cinema camera. But I do think that Canon have done some pretty great things with the C300 Mark III, and that if the price is right and it's competitive, I could see this being a really popular camera. Feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions about the camera. Would be really happy to answer anything that we can. Thank you to Canon Australia for lending it to us for a few days. We had a lot of fun. And thanks to James Gilligan, my collaborator, without whom none of this would have been possible. So thank you.